In this lecture, we're going to deal with the origins of the Ottoman Turks because they saw themselves as the heirs of an earlier group of people we call the Seljuk Turks. These were nomads from the Central Asian steppes who entered Asia Minor in the 11th century and eventually would turn Asia Minor, which the Turks today call Anadolu, into the heartland, one of the two heartlands of the future Ottoman state. Now, this is not just an exercise in medieval history. The Ottoman sultans were very conscious of the debt they owed to those earlier Seljuk Turks. The founder of the Ottoman dynasty, the man named Osman, who ruled as the first effective warlord of the Ottoman Turks, he very much was in the guise of these earlier Seljuk Turks who saw themselves as Ghazi, as warriors of the faith. He was an excellent horseman. He was well practiced with the composite bow and all the tactics of stealth and skirmish that characterized the steppe nomadic peoples since the earliest times we have reports on them by literate societies. Above all, he saw himself as the defender of the faith, as expanding Islam, Dar al-Islam, at the expense of the infidels. And these are all traditions that go back to those Seljuk Turks who had converted to Islam in the second half of the 10th century. And in the High Ottoman period, especially in the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent, there was a very assiduous effort to collect all the early traditions about these first Turks. One of the most important documents was written by a man by the name of Mahmud al-Kashgari from the city of Kashgar in Central Asia today. And he wrote the first compendium about the Turkish language, Turkish poetry, Turkish legends, and actually drew up the earliest map we have of where the Turkish tribes were located in this early period. And all of these documents survive in the Topkapi Palace Library. The reason we have these manuscripts is that the Ottoman Turks, Turkish sultans, took great pains to collect these documents to the Topkapi and draw that connection that their legacy depended very much on these earlier Seljuk Turks. And that gets us to how did the Turkish-speaking peoples enter into Asia Minor? And a question I raised earlier, our best guess is over the course of 200 years, at most, 500,000 nomadic Turkomen, that is, Turkish speakers who were nomads, or entered into Asia Minor. And in the course of 2 or 3 centuries, they eventually assimilated the vast majority of the pre-existing population who either spoke Greek or Armenian and were Christians. That gets us to these traditions that were recorded in these earlier manuscripts that have come down to us. And the ancestor of the Seljuk Turks is a man who is Seljuk, who is the grandson of an earlier figure who led the first Oyuz Turks, or Guz Turks, as they're called in Arabic, to the lands of the lower Jaxartes Valley, the Sir Daria, the great river that flows into the Aral Sea. And there, these early Turks had established an important merchant community. It's known as Yangi Kent, or as you would say in modern Turkish, Yeni Kent, that is a new settlement. And these Oyuz Turks were engaged in stock raising, breeding of camels and horses that were very, very important for the caravan trade. There's an extremely important study on this by a man named Bullitt, who dealt with why changing climatic conditions led to the creation of a new hybrid camel that was necessary to have in the caravan routes of Central Asia. And these Turks got in on the action of creating the animals necessary to sustain the caravan trade. Furthermore, these Turks had a reputation of being absolutely spectacular warriors. There were very, very few cavalry forces that could stand up to the classic nomadic horse archer, and the Oyuz Turks were among the best. And that recommended them also as allies and mercenaries to the competing Islamic states in what are now Iran and Central Asia that were trying to gain supremacy over the key caravan cities, those fabled cities known to us from various legends and travelers' reports, Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, all of these cities which for centuries were on the Silk Road that connected the Western Eurasian landmass to China. The two leading states that were contending at this time were the Ghaznavid Sultanate, which is ruled by a man named Mahmud, who was often called the Hammer of the Infidels, who ruled from 997 to about 1030, and was involved in very important expeditions into India, where he plundered Hindu and Buddhist temples, and he had money to spend. And then his opponents to the north of the Jaxartes River, the Karakhanids, they were fighting for control of these caravan cities and the right to impose their authority over the Abbasid Caliph. That is the head of Sunni Islam. And in these complicated wars, Oghuz Turks, as well as other Turkish tribes, were extremely useful. They could provide much important cavalry, and there came to rule over the Oghuz Turks two brothers. One was known as Tuğrul Bey, the older. The other is Çangri Bey. Bey is a Turkish word that means lord. It's still used in modern Turkish as almost the equivalent of sir or esquire in modern English. And they switched sides several occasions between the Ghaznavid and Karakhanids, and eventually they were settled in Khorasan, which is a vital section of northeastern Iran, and they went into business for themselves. In 1029, they seized the important city of Nishapur. Now, Nishapur was on that caravan route. It was home to various merchant communities, particularly Iranian speakers. And the two brothers, particularly Tuğrul Bey, realized that if he could come to terms with the merchant literate elites of the eastern Iranian cities, they would provide the administrative staff. Furthermore, his ancestors in the mid-10th century had converted en masse to Islam. And so they were seen in many ways as Sunni warriors who got a pass on the fact that they were from the steppes, they were barbarians, they rode horses, they wore trousers. Nonetheless, they were Muslims, and that allowed them to come to terms with the civilized elites of eastern Iran, and it is the first indication of how adaptable these Turkish conquerors would be. Now, Mahmud's successor, his son Masoud, had no choice but to fight the Oghuz Turks for control of these key cities. And in a series of complicated wars between the Ghaznavid Sultan and the Seljuk Turks, who had taken their name after the ancestor of the tribe, there was a decisive battle fought near Merv in 1040. I believe on May 23rd, 1040, the Battle of Danan Khan, where the Oghuz Turks, Seljuk Turks, just overwhelmed the Ghaznavid army. They had used the initial tactics of poisoning the wells, of leading on the opposing army, which included large numbers of infantry and an elephant corps. It ran into logistical problems. So when the decisive battle was actually fought, the enemy forces were essentially exhausted, and the Seljuk Turks were able to wear them down, flank them, and destroy the army. The Sultan, Masoud, fled to Lahore in India. He fled over the Hindu Kush, and the cities of Iran and Central Asia, one by one, fell to the Seljuk Turks. And immediately in entering these cities, Tuğrul Bey imposed strict discipline on his tribal regiments. The tendency to plunder, to commit atrocities in the city were restricted. The soldiers did conduct themselves as Muslim warriors, and it won over the support of that Iranian ruling class. It also led to a symbiosis that would persist through the whole of the Ottoman period, even when the Ottomans are fighting against their mortal enemies in Iran, in which the high culture of the emerging Turkish state was largely Iranian, that the administrators and much of the cultural and religious life was in the hands of Iranians who spoke Farsi, a form of Iranian. It's descended from the ancient Persian language. And that relationship was already forged as the Seljuk Turks steadily, over the course of the 1040s and early 1050s, took the cities of Iran and moved to Baghdad. The climax of the success came in 1055. Tuğrul Bey entered the city of Baghdad. Now, the city of Baghdad was the capital of Sunni Islam. It was really the second great capital outside of Arabia, outside of the holy cities of Medina and Mecca. It had replaced Damascus back in the 8th century, and it was seen as the great international city of the Islamic world. The caliph there, his name was Qasim al-Qasim. He legitimized the position of Tughral Bey. He issued him, in effect, what is a firman, that is a document that made Tughral Bey the Sultan. That means the guardian in Turkish and Arabic, the guardian of the caliph. And that, in effect, meant he had the legitimacy to conduct wars in the name of the caliph and to carry out whatever was necessary to defend and increase the size of Dar al-Islam, the land of the believers. Now, in 1055, the Seljuk Turks, by entering Baghdad, found themselves saddled with a very, very dangerous opponent to the west. In Cairo, and this issue will come up again, the Turks are always having trouble with Egypt, with Cairo. In Cairo was a rival caliph, an Aliyid, or as some would call him, a Shiite. He's really an Aliyid caliphate that had been established there in 969, and it was a counter-caliph to Baghdad, which had a very, very different interpretation of the role of Ali and who should lead the Islamic world. And that meant that by taking Baghdad, by getting the authority of the caliph, whose daughter actually Tughral Bey married, that henceforth the Seljuk Turks were committed to a war to fight for control of the Fertile Crescent and eventually take Cairo, which at that time, the Fatimids in Cairo, controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. This was a very, very important change in the history of the Seljuk Turks. They had entered in some ways as barbarians, and they end up becoming defenders of the Islamic order. Now, to do this, there were certain problems. First, you had a large Turkoman population that had now entered into Iraq and northern Syria, a climate and a situation that was very, very different from the Eurasian steppes. Some of the Turkish nomads moved into the more northern regions, which is known as Al Jazeera, or the island, the grasslands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where they often clashed with Arabic pastoralists who were Muslims. They also were annoying to the urban populations of Iraq and Syria and Iran, having so many of these Turkish soldiers, these tribal regiments who retained their ethnic identity, their Turkish language, even though they were Muslims, and there was invariably clashes between the citizens and the Turkish nomadic warriors. And so Tughral Bey realized that in order to maintain the integrity of his army, to maintain the discipline, he would have to move them out of those areas and find new areas to conquer. Well, the most important threat was, of course, Fatimid Egypt. That's what our aim is. The Seljuk Turks are got to take Cairo. They got to knock out that counter-caliphate. On the other hand, they also found, to their delight to some extent, that the Fatimid caliphs in Cairo were allied to the Byzantine emperors of Constantinople. Now, the Byzantine emperors of Constantinople were the successors to the Roman Empire. The empire spoke Greek as its language, but it saw itself as the legal and political descendant of imperial Rome, or as the Turks and Arabs would call it, Rum. Furthermore, they were very much Orthodox in faith. They included also many Armenians, a lot of them alienated from the emperor in Constantinople over religious figures, and they had been allied with the Fatimid Caliph since the year 1001. Well, this was an ideal situation for Tughral Bey. He released his Turkish tribal regiments on the Byzantine state to raid Asia Minor, Anatolia, to distract the Byzantines from assisting their ally in Egypt. And initially, these raids were probably strategically conceived in two ways. One, it would keep his forces occupied and keep them out of Iraq and the great cities. And furthermore, it would distract the Byzantines so that the main Turkish army could take out the Fatimids. What these raiding parties found was a Byzantine state in hopeless, almost a confused situation. Since the death of the Emperor Basil II in 1025, the state was torn between a civil and bureaucratic aristocracy. The dynasty had ended in either 1056 or 1057, however you want to account how Michael VI factors into it. And when these Turkish tribes entered Asia Minor, they found very little resistance. They were able to raid at will across Armenia and Central Asia, encountering lots of ineffective Byzantine forces, and at the same time, rich plunder. Even more important, They learned the routes in and out of Asia Minor. In 1064, they seized the cities of Ani and Kars, these Armenian cities, which were the basis for their raids into Asia Minor. And they discovered a landscape in Central Asia Minor very, very similar to the Eurasian steppes, an area that they could colonize and exploit their various herds and animals in a way that they knew in their ancestral homeland in the Central Eurasian steppes, which was not available to them in the Middle East. And so the attacks on Asia Minor, Anatolia, became very, very attractive. These increased in intensity over the next several decades. After the death of Tuğrul Bey, his nephew, Alp Arslan, succeeded, and he too directed his regiments into the Byzantine state. And the result of this is the Byzantine ruling classes got fed up with the ineffective government, and in 1068, they put on the throne a general, a man by the name of Romanus IV Diogenes, and his job was to halt the Turkish attacks and to restore the imperial position in Asia Minor. He waged several campaigns in what would later become the eastern sections of the Ottoman Empire, which at that point were the Byzantine provinces that had been annexed from the Armenians. And these campaigns proved to be inconclusive. Alp Arslan continued attacks not only into Asia Minor, but also against the Fatimans into northern Egypt. And then in 1071, Romanus Diogenes raised an enormous mercenary army to march to the east and settle the issue decisively. When that army moved, and it moved up went across Central Asia Minor and up the Murat Nehre, as it's called, that is one of the tributaries of the Euphrates, and made its way to the strategic fortress of Manzikert. Manzikert is a very important juncture in what is now eastern Turkey. It is north of Lake Van, and it was an obvious target to fortify, to carry out a reconquest of the strategic eastern areas, and to close the routes of invasion into Asia Minor. Alp Arslan heard of the movement of this imperial army. He redeployed his army from northern Syria to, in effect, Armenia with remarkable speed. But when he appeared before Manzikert, or Malazgirt, as it would be called in modern Turkish today, he was surprised at the size of the army. Romanus IV was serious about it, and initially, Alp Arslan actually wanted to negotiate. But the Byzantine emperor said, no way, the party is on. And on the 19th of August, 1071, a great battle was fought. From the start, Romanus IV had enormous problems in keeping that army in line. There was treachery in the ranks because various in-laws of his actually defected during the battle. Furthermore, the Byzantine light cavalry comprised of Turkish horse archers. These were people known as Pechenegs, who were kinsmen to the Seljuk Turks. And many of them defected to the Turkish army either on the eve of the battle or the morning of the battle. The accounts differ. And so when the Byzantine army went into action, it was without important cavalry supports. And in a classic strategic battle, in the rolling hills to the west of the modern town, if you ever visit it, there is still an Ottoman rebuilding of the Seljuk fortress there. And if you get on top, you get a very, very good view of the countryside where the battle was presumably fought. And over the course of the day, the Seljuk Turks wore down the Byzantine army with classic attacks of skirmish. Somehow, Romanus IV kept his army together, and late in the day, he called a halt. They were going to fall back to their camp, regroup for the next day. There had been no serious fighting. And in the course of the fighting, his heterogeneous army lost cohesion. The Turks counterattacked and won a stunning victory. The imperial army, we're not sure of its size. It was clearly larger than presumably 20,000 Turks. Perhaps it was 35,000 men. The imperial army was essentially annihilated. Many of the cavalry units rushed off to Constantinople and deposed Romanus. The emperor was captured. The Sultan was kind of embarrassed by the extent of his defeat, of his victory, actually released the emperor on promise of a tribute. And he'd achieved his objective. He had really crushed the Byzantine army, and that meant the road to Cairo was clear. However, in the next 10 years, the Byzantine state descended even to more chaos. and a series of civil wars. And if you can believe it, the Byzantines very quickly appreciated the martial qualities of the Seljuk Turks, and they hired various bands of Seljuk Turks to fight their civil wars. And between 1071 and 1081, these groups went into business for themselves. They seized control of Byzantine cities, originally, in many instances, being Byzantine mercenaries. And so a number of Turkish states emerged in Anatolia. And these were men who owed a vague loyalty to the Sultan in Baghdad, and Alp Arslan died soon after the battle. He was succeeded by Sultan Malik Shah, and they created their own independent sultanates and emirates. There's an important one in northeastern Turkey today at the city of Niksar, ancient Neo-Caesarea. There's beautiful Seljuk sites still there, wonderful madrases. And they're known as the Danshamid emirs, and they dominated northeastern Turkey. But the most important one was at the city of Konya, the classical city of Iconium, where a man named Suleiman seized power and created the Sultanate of Rome. And those Turks came to occupy Central Asia Minor and brought in their way of life, that is, the pastoral life of the Eurasian steppes. The grasslands were ideal. And very, very quickly, the Christians in that state had to come to terms with a conquering Turkish elite, a Turkish elite that was a military elite. The Christians continued to survive as agriculturalists in various valleys of the region known as Cappadocia, that is central Turkey today. And these are parts of the valleys of the Halis River, or the Kızıl Irmak, as it's known in Turkish, as well as subsidiary rivers. And some of them would survive really right down until the exchange of populations in the 1920s, in 1923, mandated by the Treaty of Lausanne. Others in the cities came to terms, but the emperor in Constantinople himself had to retake Asia Minor, and he didn't have the capacity to do that. In 1081, a new emperor came to the throne, a man named Alexis I, and he's the one who turned to the Western Europeans, turned to Pope Urban II to preach a crusade against the Turks in Asia Minor. And what Urban II, in effect, preached was to liberate Jerusalem from the infidels, which is not exactly what the emperor had in mind. And there is an enormous scholarship on exactly what was said when the emperor contacted Pope Urban, who lodged his appeal at the Council of Clermont in 1095, and is also the first Western European to conjure up images of Turkish atrocities, the terrible Turks. They're carrying out all these atrocities in Jerusalem. What we think really happened is that the Turks disrupted the pilgrimage trade in Asia Minor in Syria, whereby Western Europeans had traveled to the holy cities. And this had been very, very secure for several centuries, for 75 years, by the Byzantine emperors. And the Fatimid caliphs had respected it as well. In the course of the fighting between the Seljuk Turks on one side and the Fatimids and Byzantines on the other, the whole pilgrimage trade was disrupted. Many Western Europeans had to return home. They never got to Jerusalem. And we think Alexis I played upon this, and Urban then released the First Crusade. Now, from the Turkish viewpoint, the First Crusade was really quite astonishing. And the Turkish rulers in Asia Minor never could figure out who the heck was in charge of this outfit and what they really wanted to do. And from the start, the aims were quite different. The Emperor Alexis I, his son and grandson, John II and Manuel I, the so-called Comnenian emperors, wanted to use those Western Europeans as mercenaries to reconquer Asia Minor. But they didn't bank on getting such huge armies with an independent aim of their own, which was to take Jerusalem. And the result is the Crusades lent only a certain amount of help to the Byzantine emperors, just enough as they battled their way across Asia Minor to get to the holy cities. Now, that led to some initial reverses. In the First Crusade, at the Battle of Dorylaeum in 1097, the Seljuk Turk, his name, Turkish Sultan of Konya, his name is Kilji Arslan, he suffered a severe defeat at the hands of the Crusaders and learned very, very quickly to avoid the charges of heavy European cavalry. The Crusaders occupied his capital, but the Turks just fled east. And then the Crusaders crossed the Taurus Mountains and they were off the Anatolian plain. And what happened from 1097 to 1176, actually, were a series of desultory frontier wars between the Byzantines on the one hand and the Turks on the other, primarily the Sultan of Konya, because his state was literally on the boundaries of the restored Byzantine Empire. Because of the Crusades, the emperors in Constantinople occupied the western third of Asia Minor, where the cities were located. But the interior was essentially always held by the Turks. And that's where they could bring in their way of life, come to terms with the Christian agriculturalists, the Christians in the towns, and start to build an effective Turkish state. Now, in the course of these wars, which we need not go into the details, several important features came out. First, the nature of the fighting favored the Turks. Ultimately, these were border wars. They led to devastations on both sides of the frontier. It led to the breakdown of cisterns, of roads, bridges were not repaired, and urban life declined. This was turning the landscape of Asia Minor into a terrain that favored the Turkish way of life much more than the bureaucratic state of Constantinople that depended on officials and episcopal organization. Furthermore, churches and above all monasteries were repeatedly sacked, and that will have major implications in the religious transformation of Asia Minor, so that by 1200 AD, those Christians under Turkish rule really have no clergy to assist them in maintaining their Christian faith, and that will tip the balance in causing many of these Christians eventually to convert to Islam. And finally, in the course of this fighting, the Byzantine emperors exhausted their fragile resources. They essentially only had the ability to launch one substantial field army. And it took all of their effort to do that. And the most important and impressive field army in that period, assembled by the Emperor Manuel I, was decisively defeated on September 17th in 1176 at the Battle of Myrocephalon. The Turkish Sultan, Khilji Arslan II, lured the imperial army into a narrow valley. There's still a dispute as to where this valley is located, but it is clearly immediately west of Konya. And in the course of this battle, the imperial army was just cut to pieces. Manuel I had to evacuate the conquest, and it literally opened up Asia Minor to the piecemeal conquest and occupation by the Seljuk Turks. And after that, after 1176, the Byzantine state was really in a very, very weak position to defend its possessions in Asia Minor. However, the Byzantines never gave up on the hope that despite these military setbacks, that they could convert the Seljuk Turks to Christianity. The Byzantines, in the course of these wars, learned a great deal about the Turks, just as the Turks learned a great deal about the Byzantines. And the Byzantines had success in converting other steppe nomads, notably the Bulgars in the Balkans, who became Christian Bulgarians. At least until the early 13th century, the Seljuk sultans of Rum, the Danshimid emirs, the emirs and rulers farther east in cities like Diyarbakir, in Urfa, ancient Edessa, all of these Turks were really stunned and entranced by the image of imperial Rome. Constantinople was still the fabled city, the city in the Quran that was destined to be captured, and there were constant missions and exchanges. And for the longest time, I always think that the Seljuk Turks, through the whole course of the late 11th and 12th century, were really living in the cultural shadow of Constantinople. But that conversion never came about. That the folk Islam, embraced by the Seljuk Turks in the 10th century, held those Turks together was all important. It was the cement to a Turkish identity. And there is still a close identification of Islam, however it's interpreted, a form of Sunni Islam with a Turkish identity and nationalism today in modern Turkey. And it's a very, very powerful bond. And ultimately, that proves stronger than the material culture, the images of imperial grandeur, the exchanges with the Byzantine emperor. And so the Turks remained loyal to their Islam. They continued to fight an uneven struggle, a seesaw struggle with the Byzantines over Asia Minor, and then an event occurred, really outside of anyone's control, the Byzantines or the Seljuk Turks. On the 13th and 15th of April in 1204, members of the Fourth Crusade, pledged to restore Jerusalem, stormed and sacked the city of Constantinople. Byzantine power was now finished. The Byzantine state as a political power had been destroyed, it was shattered, and all of a sudden, the situation with the Turks in Asia Minor had changed significantly. The sultans of Konya could now step out of the shadow of Byzantium.